Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you all for joining us to this How To Academy event. Tonight we are joined by Harvard professor Joseph Henrich, award-winning anthropologist and a professor and chair of the Department of Human Evolutionary Biology at Harvard University. In this live-streamed event, drawing on a decade of leading research since his groundbreaking 2010 research paper, Professor Henrich joins us to explore the historical evolution of family structures, marriage and religion, to analyze how these institutions shaped the Western mind. The presentation will last about 40 minutes, followed by a Q&A session, and you can submit your questions through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now, without further ado, over to you, Professor Henrich.
All right, thank you, Laura. I am just going to share my screen here. Let's see, hopefully this will do it. Okay, well, this is an unusual way to do this, but I'm looking forward to it. So what we're starting here with this is the cover of my new book that just came out, The Weirdest People in the World. I'm going to be talking about psychological variation and trying to explore and explain the psychological variation we find around the world. I really like the UK cover, which is rather different from the US cover, because I grew up in a household that had hams with pineapples on it and jello molds and even wood paneling on the walls. So this image makes me feel at home. Hang on. Okay, so to get us started, to warm us up, I thought we'd start with this little task that psychologists have used to map how people think about themselves around the world. So if you could just take 5 seconds and think to yourself how you would fill this in. So I am with three things in there. I'll give you a few seconds. All right, now there's a number of different ways to fill this in. Maybe you filled it in using this strategy. So I am Jessica's father, I am a brother, I am Ara's friend. That would be one strategy. Now, if you're like me, you probably didn't do it this way. You probably did something more like this. I am curious, I am a scientist, I am a sea kayaker. And so what psychologists have found when they've deployed this in a wide range of diverse societies is that people actually vary. And if you do this amongst, say, American undergraduates, and you can ask them for 20 different responses, all 20 of them will be filled in with attributes, aspirations, and accomplishments. So things that are telling you about me, about my characteristics, about the things I think that are special about me or make me different. Now, at the other end of the spectrum, there are places in the world, and so one of them is the Maasai, which is an ethno-linguistic group in northern Tanzania and southern Kenya. And you'll get nearly 100%, so something like 80% responses that are relationships, relatives, and roles. So rather than telling you about the details that make me special, I'm telling you about how I'm interconnected with the world, what my enduring relationships are. And so there's a lot of variation around the world, and people that we consider Western end up at the extreme end of the distribution. So this is one example of what we call the individualism complex. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz famously noticed this in the early 1970s, when, based on a reading of many different ethnographies from around the world, Geertz wrote that the Western conception of the person as a bounded, unique, and more or less integrated motivational and cognitive universe is, however incorrigible it may seem to us, a rather peculiar idea within the context of the world's cultures. And it turns out there's a lot of things attached to that. People at the more individualistic end of the spectrum tend to be focused on themselves, thinking about their attributes, accomplishments, and aspirations. They tend to view the self as not interconnected with other people, but actually kind of more like an atom. And you can even see this when you do neuroscience. When you ask people to think about others, you see differences within patterns of brain activation when thinking about the self versus others across societies. Another feature is guilt. So people from Western societies tend to be very guilt-ridden or guilt-oriented. And this means that they're failing to live up to their own acquired standards, as opposed to shame societies, which anthropologists have long identified, where people are responding to many different social norms that characterize their society. So shame versus guilt seems to roughly go along with these other items. Overconfidence, so people at the individualistic end of the spectrum tend to be overconfident. They overestimate their ability to succeed in particular domains. And they also self-enhance, which means they emphasize and overemphasize their qualities. All right, so just to give you a sense of the variation globally, this is a measure developed by the Dutch social psychologist, Geert Hofstede, and it's a measure of psychological individualism. It's very much a compilation of the different things I just talked about. Not all of them, but several of them. And you can see that the dark blue are the most individualistic countries in the world, individualistic places in the world. I'm using country averages, which I don't always like to do, and we're going to see much finer grained data in a little bit later. But this gives us some kind of a broad spectrum. I'll emphasize here that there's a lot of gray, and this is psychological terra incognito. So this enterprise of understanding psychological variation around the world has really just begun, and there's a lot of information we don't have. So you can see almost all of Africa, Central Asia are gray. I'll note that societies, Americans are the most individualistic in the world by this scale, followed by Australians, and closely followed by the Brits. If you get down to Canada and New Zealand, you're at about 80, and you're still at the high end of individualism. Okay, now if we were to plot this for, and you can kind of see it on this plot, but it's pretty much Western societies are at the extreme end of the distribution, and all of these tend to clump together. I don't think they have to go together. I think they can in principle be split, so they're not some kind of unified psychological package. It's just that history and cultural evolution has brought them together. Now, it turns out that individualism, which psychologists have long recognized varies across societies, is just the tip of an iceberg of psychological variation that we find when we begin to look across the world. So another one is the use of intentions or other mental states in making moral judgments about others. So you give people scenarios in which someone did something on purpose or by accident, but the outcome is the same. It's a murder, a theft, a battery, something like that. People from Western societies tend to place the most importance on the role of intentions. The internal mental states, the hidden invisible things we can't see, seem to play a big role. Similarly, in analytic versus holistic thinking styles, populations that are analytic thinkers tend to focus on objects, assign them properties, and then try to explain behavior and categorize based on those properties. This applies to particles, whether you're thinking about electrons or protons. It applies to people. You assign them personalities, dispositions. Economists give them preferences, versus a more holistic approach where you think about the relationships among individuals, items, particles, whatever it is you're trying to explain, and look at the context and background. And this affects things like memory and perception as well. Non-relational morality. So this is whether you make moral judgments based on a lot of contextual factors or universal principles. Dispositional thinking. Broadly, across the available data we have, Westerners tend to think about things more dispositionally. When you see someone, say, slip on the floor, you could believe dispositionally that the person is clumsy. That would be a dispositional attribution, versus there was water on the floor. That's a contextual attribution. So Westerners tend to make the more dispositional attributions. This seems to relate to two phenomena, which I won't go into detail on, but if you've ever taken a course in social psychology, you've probably heard about cognitive dissonance and the fundamental attribution error. They're both presented in psychology textbooks as features of human psychology. But they turn out to be just features of a particular group's psychology. It happens to be the group who dominates psychology textbooks. Trust in strangers varies a lot across societies. Willingness to, or interest in conforming to peers varies a lot. And inclinations to defer gratification. So work now to get more money or other resources later. So those things all vary across societies, and the list goes deep. We don't really know how deep the iceberg goes in the psychological variation. So some colleagues and I, about 10 years ago, well, exactly 10 years ago, dubbed this population, the population that really dominates our psychology textbooks and our understandings from behavioral economics, as Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. So we can characterize them as weird. We were using this in a paper as part of a criticism of the behavioral sciences and saying how biased and unrepresentative the database of psychology was. And back then, so a study in 2008 showed that 96% of participants in psychology studies were from these weird societies. Now, 10 years later, the percentage is about 95% is the latest count. In developmental psychology, it's a little bit lower, more like 92%. So still, despite having raised the alarm on this, this database is still dominated by people from Western societies. Now, this affects many different aspects of our psychology. So aspects that people would consider basic. So I mentioned memory. It affects what people pay attention to. Visual perception, spatial reasoning, our olfactory system, so our ability to smell things, our psychology of time, and a number of other things. All right, so the big question I've been working on for the last 10 years is how can we explain this variation? And in particular, part of the question here is why do European populations and their cultural descendants in North America and Australia, why are they so particularly peculiar along so many dimensions of psychology? Now, I laid a foundation for this in my 2015 book called The Secret of Our Success. And in that, the ideas that I developed there is that we're a particularly cultural species, and that we've actually evolved in our large brains are not for solving problems or for solving problems on our own, but for learning from other people. And it's this capacity to learn from other people that gives rise to the system that gives us our tools and our technology and our ability to use resources and travel and make boats and all the kinds of things that we see that has happened over the course of human evolution. And throughout this process, as our brains expanded over the last 2 million years, they became increasingly self-programmable. So this little diagram I have here comparing chimpanzees and humans is just one recent illustration, studies of our brain showing that large sections of our brains are not, their content is not heritable, that they're there to be filled up with different aspects of psychology, different ways of processing information that comes from the world. And we seem to be adaptive in who we learn from and who we pay attention to that allows us to be adaptively self-programmable. But then this has important implications for psychology because it means that you're going to end up with some psychological variation. So culture shapes how we think. And there's a number of simple examples which help illustrate that. And I'll just mention a couple before I get to the kind of meat of today's talk. So technology shape how we think. So human society studied by anthropologists, some of them count 1, 2, 3 many. So they can't differentiate 37 from 38. So over time, these number systems increase. Some societies have 12, some societies can count up to 26. I mentioned 38. And then eventually someone figured out recursive systems and we have a base 10 system that's recursive. So in principle, we could count without bounds. Then if you do psychological experiments on people who grew up with a numbering system, they have mathematical abilities that you can detect, and they think about the world differently. They have new cognitive abilities. Same thing with aspects of math. And also with the process of learning to read. So learning to read gives you specialized circuitries in your left hemisphere, a thicker corpus callosum, a longer verbal memory. So again, culture is shaping how we think. Languages, there's interesting research on how languages shapes how we think. A simple example would be, all of you speak English, obviously, and you differentiate left from right. And you learn to differentiate left from right growing up. That's a technology. Not all languages have left and right. Some languages, people do everything by absolute coordinate systems, north, south, east, and west. But once you have left and right, it becomes embedded in your language and cultural routines. You get good at thinking about it. It takes kids remarkably long to figure out their left from their right. But then it becomes a new tool with which you can organize the world. You can make a similar argument about the evolution of color terms, things like red, white, and blue. Institutions. Now, this is the important one for today. So human cultural learning, the ability to learn from each other, gives rise to these things we call social norms in common language. And what a social norm is, it's when you culturally learn a behavior or way of doing something and the standards for judging others. So if you have a community where people have all learned the same thing to do and the standards for judging those who don't do that thing, say judging them poorly, then you lock up. And if there's a particular way of doing things where unilateral deviations, people get sanctioned or people don't think well of them, and then that brings them back into line. So you get these social norms. Packages of social norms are institutions. So this is a way you can use evolutionary theory to eventually get to ideas about social norms. Now today, I'm particularly interested in the most fundamental of human institutions, and that's associated with family, so marriage and the family. And I'm going to make the case that the family actually shapes how people think about the world and many of the aspects of psychology that I just mentioned. All right, now an interesting place to start in thinking about families is to recognize how unusual most of the families we think of, so weird families. Now, here I'm drawing data here in this table. I'm drawing data from the Ethnographic Atlas, which is an anthropological database of over 1,200 societies in which, anthropologists are obsessed with kinship because so many societies are obsessed with kinship. And it illustrates how unusual the Western family is. So bilateral descent, that's when you track a child or a person's descent through both their parents, through mom and dad. And you can see that most societies don't do that. Most societies have unilineal inheritance, either predominantly through dad or entirely through dad, or predominantly through mom or entirely through mom. So over 70% of societies don't have bilateral inheritance. 75% of societies have some cousin marriage, and it's often an important domain of marriage. 85% of societies allow men to take additional wives, so they marry polygynously. Polygyny is when men can take additional wives. Very rarely in the cross-cultural record do we find polyandry, when a woman can take multiple husbands. Over 90% of societies don't live in nuclear families, so nuclear families are rare, only 8%, and neolocal residence. So that's when the husband and wife, when they get married, they set up a separate household, separate from either families. And so 95% of families don't do it that way. If you count all these up, you get this plot here. And so the 0 here means these are groups that don't have any of these traits. And this actually happens to be about 50.1%. So over half of all human societies in this database don't have any weird kinship practices. And then you go all the way down here to groups with all 5. And these are either Western societies or societies that were influenced by Catholic missionaries early on. So for example, one society in here is in Cebu in the Philippines. It just happens to be the place that Ferdinand Magellan, well, that's actually where he died. But before he died, he began railing against polygyny and some of the other cultural practices. He had a bunch of priests on board. Okay, so this leads to less intensive kinship. So monogamous nuclear families are an unusual family structure in a global and historical perspective. Most other societies have had these kinds of practices. Now, the key idea here is that our psychology, our minds are adapting to the family structures in which we appear into. And most societies have had all these practices like cousin marriage and polygyny, various rules about inheritance that bind networks together, large families. So if you're born into one of these intensive kinship societies where you get these networks of families, most of your relationships are given at birth. So you don't go out and find lots of different friends and business partners. You have a lot of roles and responsibilities that you acquire simply by being born into that society in a particular place. So a lot of your job is in some sense fulfilling these roles. When you do seek out new relationships, you're going to seek them out on the basis of these other network connections. So what's going to guarantee trust, which is the next thing I'm going to show you, is that someone is interconnected to you in a way. It's the social connections that create trust, not the dispositions. Meanwhile, in a world of weak and mobile world of weak kinship, everybody's in a marketplace for relationships. You've got to go out and find your friends and your business partners and your spouses, and you're kind of shopping. So you need to cultivate dispositional attributes that you can use to sell yourself in this marketplace. And you're seeking out others based on their personal attributes because the webbing that connects society is weaker and more ephemeral. I mentioned the trust in a more individualistic world, the trust is based on dispositions. You're looking for someone who you can trust because they're trustworthy and not because they're socially interconnected to you in a way that guarantees they're trustworthy. In an individualistic world, you tend to rely on guilt because you're trying to live up to a particular set of standards you've adopted as a way of cultivating your own uniqueness to perform well in this market, as opposed to a world of shame where you're trying to comply with all these various roles and responsibilities that you have. In one system, in the intensive kinship system, your identity is based on your relationships. So you offer that you're a member of a clan or a particular group. Whereas the other, it's this cultivated self. It's this unitary self. Okay, so that just gives you some sense. In one sense, you're molding your minds and strategies and motivations and ways of thinking to these two different worlds. Of course, there's a continuum, and that'll become clear in a minute. Now, the next question would be, well, when did European kin groups dissolve and become monogamous nuclear families? And there's a sense out there that this occurred with the Industrial Revolution. But the historical evidence is clear that it's well before the Industrial Revolution. The statistical evidence goes back to at least 1500. But then there's, less statistically powerful evidence going further back in time. So just to give you a sense and get you thinking about how far back this goes, think about the kinship term sister-in-law. So we all use it, and many of us don't know what the in-law part of sister-in-law. Why is our brother's wife our sister-in-law? What's the law? Well, the law turns out to be canon law. She's your sister in canon law, and the church is trying to say, well, she's like your sister, which means no sex or marriage. And now you've got to apply that to this other relative, which in many human societies would be an encouraged marriage partner. So, levirate marriage is when your husband dies, you marry his brother. So a biblically approved practice. Okay, another way to kind of bring you into this kinship thing is to think about something you may have heard at a marriage ceremony. So you may have heard a priest or some other religious leader say, if anyone here can show just cause why this couple cannot lawfully be joined together in holy matrimony, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. And then there's usually a pregnant pause, and then they press on. Of course, in TV and movie, usually someone comes bumbling in the back and raises a riot. But this actually comes from the Carolingian Empire, and it's part of an incest inquiry. So in order to police incest regulations, there was this part of the marriage ceremony put in where the priest would do a double check and make sure none of the relatives know whether they're cousins or they might be in-laws or somehow related, just as a final check. So this is actually about incest. So this was part of an expansion of incest taboos that the Catholic Church began imposing on the tribes of Europe, beginning in late antiquity and extending through the Middle Ages. The sister-in-law bit, it actually begins with prohibitions on levirate marriage that go back to the 4th century. Now, the taboos on these relatives actually expand. They begin with first cousins, say 6th century, and then all the way up to the 11th century on 6th cousins. Then things are reeled in a bit in 1215. Church also bans polygamy. Polygamy very popular among European tribes, pre-Christian European tribes. They also ban sex slaves, which were common in Rome. They try to put an end to arranged marriage. It does continue at the elite levels, but as far as below the elite levels, they were trying to stop arranged marriages, which is, of course, cross-culturally common. As part of this is why the bride in the marriage ceremony gets to say, I do. In most societies, no one cares what the bride thinks. So this is part of an effort to make sure that it's a mutual marriage. The church also discourages corporate ownership of land because it wants to free up individuals to be able to pass their inheritance to the church. And that had a big effect on the wealth in the church. Okay, and so here I'll just reference, I'm not going to point to the many people that fed into some of these ideas, but Jack Goody, the British social anthropologist, wrote this book in the early 80s, which had a big impact and lays out some of these ideas. Okay, so that is a little bit of background. And now the goal here, we're trying to get to explaining the I am a kayaker, the weirder psychology. How can we explain this psychological variation? And the case I lay out is that this began with the Western Church, when the Western Church began to spread, and through various techniques, somewhat imposed, some by example, various ways. It took centuries. These policies, this marriage and family program, which demolishes the complex kinship in Europe and breaks everyone down into monogamous nuclear families. So the red is historical process and the green arrow is indicating psychological effects. Now, this social change in the families and the dissolution of tribes has an impact on the kinds of institutions that then emerge. So one of the things that medieval Europe is characterized by is a proliferation of voluntary associations. This is well-established European history. So you get the spread of charter towns, guilds, new kinds of monasteries, and universities. And these begin as initially kind of mutual aid society, because I don't have my big kin network anymore, right? So I got to go out, and I can't build one because the church has all these rules against the things that I would normally do to build that kin network. So I begin voluntary associations where we mutually insure each other. So if we get injured, we get old, all that is taken care of, as well as protection. And so in these charter towns, people are opting in as individuals or nuclear families, and they're becoming citizens, and they're getting rights, roles, and responsibilities as citizens. And towns and these other voluntary organizations are recruiting, what they think are good members. And so I make the case, using contemporary evidence, that competition amongst voluntary associations affects the kinds of cultural psychologies that evolve. It also leads to rapid rising urbanization. So Europe was at about 1% urbanization in 800. It passes China in about 1200 and continues rocketing up to the current day. It passes the Middle East's Mediterranean around 1600. Okay, that leads to the spread of impersonal markets. And I make the case that markets have an independent effect on people's psychology. So again, the green arrow indicates a psychological effect. And finally, I make the point that you have this evolving weirder psychology. People are more trusting in strangers, more individualistic, more focused on themselves and their attributes. And that shapes the kinds of laws that people develop, the kinds of new religions they invent, the likelihood of new innovations, the growth of financial markets, and eventually economic growth. All right, so I am just going to give you a little bit to kind of dig you into the weeds a bit on this arrow, this red arrow, and then this green arrow. I'm going to focus mostly on the green arrow, but you'll see. Okay, so how do you test this idea? So it's a proposal. This roughly fits with the historical data, but we need real evidence. Okay, so we have the Church's Marriage and Family Program, and that should lead to a change in the kin-based institutions of Europe. So things like a decline in cousin marriage or in polygyny. And that should lead to a weirder psychology, because it's actually the kinship, not the church directly, that's doing the work here. But of course, since these two are related, there has to be a relationship here. So I'm thinking here of statistical relationships. So my colleagues and I, 3 economists, we put together evidence from around the globe on kinship intensity. So that we used exactly the data that I showed you earlier. So whether a society has cousin marriage, whether it has polygyny, the more it has of these traits, the greater its kinship intensity. And so we put that together, and we can map the globe using that anthropological database I mentioned. Now that's anthropological data, so we also wanted to get something, real evidence on the ground, you can think of it. So we gathered cousin marriage data from around the world. And then finally, we gathered data on the duration, the number of centuries that each population had been under the Church's Marriage and Family Program. All right, and then we gathered the available psychological evidence that we could find, with a simple prediction that the greater exposure to the church or lower levels of kinship intensity should predict greater psychological individualism and independence, less conformity and obedience, greater impersonal prosociality and trust, less particularistic or relational morality, and greater use of intentionality and moral judgments. We use a blizzard of different kinds of data, so survey, experiments, laboratory experiments, survey measures, and ecologically embedded measures. And I'll give you just the smallest taste of each one. Okay, just now the highest level gloss of the evidence that I can show you is this first one. So here we've taken the number of centuries under the medieval church. For this particular plot, we only have the Western church, but I'll show you the Eastern church, which we expect to be a contrasting case for reasons I'll explain. And around the world, you can also show this within Europe, places that had more centuries under the church have had lower rates of cousin marriage. This is mid-20th century data for the cousin marriage. And then can we link the kin-based institutions to the psychology? Well, we got 18 different measures of psychology from around the world generated by the theoretical idea, and a lot of them are correlated. So one of the things we're able to do is just put them all together into a single index. And we can show that greater rates of cousin marriage across countries predicts less individualism and less impersonality, prosocial psychology. So these are the broad patterns. And then finally, we can go directly from the church to weird psychology. So more centuries under the church means greater individualistic impersonal psychology. And here we have enough data to look at the Eastern church. So you have the church is unified, right, until the Great Schism, 1054. But it's really moving apart, and there's different spheres increasingly becoming different. The Western church is doubling down on its taboos against cousin marriage, and it's more enthusiastically enforcing these compared to the East, which has some of the same policies, but less enthusiastic support, and doesn't expand the taboos in the same way. And so we often see a weaker effect with the Eastern church. which is what we'd expect. Just to show you a psychological experiment. So if you've taken a course in social psychology, you'll see the you're probably familiar with the Asch conformity test. So in this experiment, a subject hears some other students answering the question of the target line matches which of these lines. And there's an obviously right answer that most people will get if asked. They'll get it 98, 97% of the time. But then during certain critical trials over a series of rounds, the subject will hear two other people give the same wrong answer. And then the question is, how often does the subject go along with the two wrong answers or go with the answer that they would have given had they gone first? We can say with high probability. So it's kind of the percentage of time you go along with the peers. And the greater your kinship intensity, the more inclined people, the more willing people are to go along with their peers. We can use cousin marriage as another way of measuring kinship intensity, and we get the same result there. And if we use the number of years under the church, you get less conformity, less willingness to go along with the peers in this classic psychology experiment. Now, I could show you lots of evidence where we measure people's willingness to cooperate with strangers in the laboratory. I really prefer the real world data. So my colleagues and I, this was actually led by Jonathan Schultz, an economist at George Mason University. He got data from the WHO, so the World Health Organization, on anonymous voluntary blood donations. So this bears a similarity to how we'd measure in the lab by looking with people's willingness to concentrate or start to cooperate with anonymous strangers in the lab. And what you can show is that places that had greater kinship intensity show less willingness to make voluntary blood donations, higher rates of cousin marriage, less willingness for these to make voluntary blood donations. You don't see this on blood donations to kin. So it's clear that this is something about social distance. And then church exposure, you see the same kind of patterns. With the strongest effect, more years under the church, more voluntary blood donations, and a weaker effect for the Eastern Church, which is right here. Now, there's enough data here that we can do lots of statistical checks, so we can control for all kinds of features of geography, climate, facts about history, and we also only compare Catholic countries with other Catholic countries, same religiosity, so we can hold all that constant for the comparisons. Another interesting natural experiment is done by, so diplomats from around the world come to New York City, into Manhattan, and at least up until 2002, so after 9/11, diplomatic immunity was ended, but there's this long period where diplomats could accumulate parking tickets, and the NYPD would still put parking tickets on cars, but they wouldn't have to pay them. So they didn't actually have the financial penalty. And what you show is that greater kinship intensity leads to more unpaid parking tickets or more cousin marriage, more unpaid parking tickets. This is actually a log scale, so the effects are pretty big. More years under the church, fewer of these unpaid parking tickets. There's lots of variation, obviously, around the world. You see the same kind of thing here with the Eastern and Western churches. So again, I could show you laboratory experiments where you do a very controlled experiment and you get the same kind of parallel results. This is just documenting that you get the same thing in the real world. And again, we can use a full battery of controls for all kinds of things to make sure that holds up. Now, I think the more interesting, and that's just kind of showing there's interesting patterns of variation around the world. You wouldn't want to infer anything causal just from those correlations. This gets a bit more interesting when we compare Europeans living in the same country. So what we did is we created a database of all the bishoprics in Europe and the year at which they were founded. And then we could look at the people who now live near those bishoprics, and then give them a dosage of how long they were under the Roman Catholic Church. Now, you'll see this. So it starts in around 500, and then the bishoprics begin to spread. So I'll wait till it gets back to 500. You'll see, so it's about to go around, and so they begin spreading, and you'll see sometimes these are gray, and that's when that area of land was captured by some political power that is hostile to the Bishop of Rome, to the Pope. So you'll see in Spain, which had early bishoprics, it goes gray for a long time because it was conquered by Muslim powers. All right. So we use that data to get dosages across Europe for the number of centuries for each region of Europe. And of course, we have the Carolingian Empire here because we think that plays a particularly important role, and we have the Iron Curtain here because we want to make sure we're not picking up on that. All right. So then what we can do is we compare people living in the same European country, but in different regions that have different amounts of dosages of the Catholic Church. And we measure 4 psychological dimensions. So conformity and obedience, individualism and independence, impersonal fairness, and impersonal trust across these places. And what we find is that individuals from regions with longer exposure to the church show greater trust, less impersonal fairness, less conformity and obedience, and greater individualism and independence. Now remember, we're only comparing people from the same country, so nothing about national wealth, nothing about national health care, or anything can play in here. We also hold constant individual levels of income, education, and individual demographics. So all this is identified, to use the economics term, is figured out from comparing people of the same income and same education. We can also hold constant climate, Roman influence, prosperity when the process started in 500, medieval universities. We can show it if we look at only socialist Europe, so only everything to the east of the curtain, and we get that effect. We can also link cousin marriage to these data. So if we get 20th century cousin marriage data, and we could only find it for 68 regions in Europe, but these regions are in Italy, Spain, France, and Turkey. What I'm showing you here is that a greater prevalence of cousin marriage is associated with less individualism, just comparing European regions. And again, we can do that for this just within the same country. Same thing here, less cousin marriage, or greater cousin marriage, less impersonal fairness. Conformity and obedience, you get more conformity and obedience. Now I put Turkey on here just as a reference point. All these results hold if we remove Turkey, but you can see Turkey has higher rates of cousin marriage and they fit right along the line. So you can even put, that suggests the work here is being done by our variable, the prevalence of cousin marriage. Okay, and I just wanted to mention that we can also use church exposure to predict the amount of cousin marriage in the 20th century. So we're connecting these different dots. Okay, and then we can zoom in on Italy and just compare Italians with other Italians. Now, Italy is a really interesting place to do this research because, of course, it has Rome, seat of the Catholic Church, but northern and southern Italy have very different histories. So northern Italy is under the Carolingian Empire, and southern Italy is variously ruled by the Byzantine Empire, various Islamic powers, and so it has this very different history. And its cousin marriage varies across the 93 provinces. That's what this is showing. And you can use those rates at the province level to predict blood donation. So remember, I use blood donations as a measure of willingness to cooperate with strangers, and there's a strong relationship there. You can control for all kinds of things, so hold constant all kinds of things. You also get more corruption when you have higher cousin marriage, and less impersonal trust. So we have data on whether people get loans from friends or banks. We also have whether they prefer cash or checks. And these can be measures of this trust in impersonal institutions. And that seems to go along with cousin marriage as well. Okay, so that is this psychological link. Now the argument is that this change in family structure then opened the door for these other transformations, which all have their own independent effects that I kind of lay out as the book goes along. So one of the interesting ones is rising urbanization and the rise of markets has a series of effects. So something like the endowment effect, which some of you might be familiar with, it's characterized as one of these biases that people have where they overvalue the things they themselves own. Turns out that's just in non-market integrated populations, you don't see that. Okay, and then toward the end of the account, I look at how this changing psychology would have affected laws, the spread of representative governments, innovation, growth of financial markets, and what like that, because of a change in the social world and the psychology that goes along with that. Okay, just a quick note here. I'm just about out of time. I want to make sure to leave time for questions. So one of the key ideas that I take in at the end of the book from my previous book, The Secret of Our Success, is that really the key to understanding innovation is the flow of ideas among diverse minds. So the larger your population, the more people know different stuff and can freely interact and share ideas, the faster innovation goes. And there's all kinds of evidence that one can point to for this. There's actually a weird cultural model that innovation is driven by great minds, by heroic inventors, but there's almost no evidence for that. But it is a strong cultural model, so there's a lot of resistance to this idea. So in the book, I make the case of why you would have seen a rising rate of innovation in Europe. So urbanization, urban areas just tend to be more innovative. you can just look at US cities, and bigger cities are disproportionately more innovative. So of course they're going to be bigger because they have more people, but they're extra innovative. Like the larger you get extra innovation. Europe had greater residential mobility, and the model of learning a trade included a journeyman phase where it's kind of like a postdoc. After you finish your training as an apprentice, you're fully qualified to do it, but you have to go work at someone else's shop. Often that shop was far away, and that's a great chance to exchange ideas about how to do things. As part of the spread of voluntary associations, you also get lots of professional societies, and this again brings lots of ideas together. Widespread literacy driven by Protestantism leads to a free flow of information there. And then the psychological changes, so greater trust in strangers, not just building your local close network, but reaching out to people very different from yourself can lead to an exchange of ideas. Both individualism and nonconformity promote innovation, preference for novelty, not a strong reliance on tradition or on the authority of elders, and valuing creativity. Greater tolerance plays an important role. So one of my favorite findings is that European towns that didn't oppress their Jewish populations had faster urban growth. And this is in medieval Europe. And the data is really good from the US, showing that more innovation leads to more immigration leads to more innovation. Immigrants bring in new ideas, new ways of doing things, and they fertilize, and they actually make the native-born inhabitants more innovative. So there's a kind of, it's not just them bringing ideas, it's the recombination. All right, so that's the Industrial Revolution. All right, so let me just close up here, last slide. I'm trying to develop this kind of new way of thinking about history and psychology. And I traced one particular aspect of psychology, weird psychology, and traced it back to the peculiar religious taboos and taboos related to marriage and sex coming from one religion, one radical religious group that transformed the families of medieval Europeans and led to a rather different psychology. I think that you could do this in interesting ways with lots of other societies. So this just happens to be where the data is because of the way psychology has evolved as a discipline. But then the broader picture here is we need to think of psychology not as fixed. Psychologists tend to think of the psychology textbook as about human psychology, when actually it's the psychology that most of the stuff in that book is about is a product of these historical processes going through time. So psychology needs to become a historical discipline and think about how history, institutions, language, and technology shapes how we think. And then of course, history has to become a psychological discipline. All right. So that's all for me. So I will go to the questions here. Let's see here. Yeah, so the first question from Linda, Western style democracy is a practical and realistic solution for non-weird. Well, I don't know if we have the data to sort of answer that in any definitive way, but Jonathan Schiltz, that economist I mentioned earlier, has specifically looked at kinship tightness, cousin marriage, and how that relates to things like voting, political participation, signing petitions, kind of all the civic action you need to make a democracy run. And it does seem that societies with weaker families tend to do better in things like the petitions and the voting, the frequency of voting and whatnot. So there's definitely a relationship there. Of course, in the modern world, urbanization and other kinds of processes are breaking down the family just because people can move to cities, they can get jobs, there's social safety nets. So the basic functions of kinship are being undermined by the kind of globalization process. And that's one of the things I talk about in the final chapter. I can enter that in the chat. So I'm responding to Linda's question, which says, can you enter the citations for democracy in the chat? I will do that at the end, Linda, but it is Jonathan Schiltz, and he is an economist at George Mason University in Virginia. So Daniela, does this challenge all of the evolutionary psychology conclusions? Do all of them hold outside of weird psychology? So so evolutionary psychology, I in many ways consider myself an evolutionary psychologist. I try to use the logic of natural selection to think about our minds, But the conclusion I came to that's different than some of my colleagues is that one of the ways in which we've evolved is actually to be powerful cultural learners and to be able to acquire ideas, values, beliefs, and behaviors from others. But that doesn't mean that our ape heritage isn't important. There's lots of things like, for example, I'm interested in social status. And if you look at the dominance displays that you see in apes, they look a lot like human dominance displays. And if you look at dominance hierarchies that sometimes appear in human groups, you can learn a lot about those by thinking about those in the context of other species. Now but I think the key part of this though is that when we have a theory that we think should predict the human universal, we can't just test it in undergrads. And so we need to test it across diverse societies. And sometimes those hold up and sometimes they don't. There's a special issue just out in the journal Evolution and Human Behavior, which is in many ways the core journal in evolutionary psychology. And there you'll find lots of articles that kind of look at variation in different domains, whether it's morality or olfaction or PTSD, so moral injury. There's some evolutionary psychology ideas about PTSD. So. Okay, altruism, blood and parking tickets. Right, so important point. So Danielle asks about altruism and thinking about blood and parking tickets. Is the data suggesting that you are more altruistic to state if weird and more altruistic to... Yeah, so I think the way to do it is to think that you're less altruistic to kin as you become more impersonally pro-social. So you actually, so when we do these experiments, people are kind of less nice to their close relatives than they should be, right? You should take in some of those games so you can give to your kinfolk, but people don't do that. Instead, they'll give some weight to the impersonal institution. So it's all about these two virtues, right? One of the experiments I like is called the passenger's dilemma. So in the passenger's dilemma, you give people a choice. You're with a friend, you're in a car, he's driving recklessly, he hits someone, kills them. And then there's going to be a trial, and his lawyer says that if you testify in court that he was going under the speed limit, he wasn't, then he'll get off and it's no problem. Otherwise, he might face serious jail time. What are you going to do? And so there's a lot of variation across societies in this, and there's two virtues here, right? One is helping your friends. We all think helping our friends is good. We don't want to see our friend go to jail, so that's good. And then other is kind of, I'm going to take an oath. Am I going to lie to the court? Am I going to, violate the law? And so those two things trade off. So what you're seeing is two different virtues trading off. All right, anonymous attendee. Okay, do you think a decrease in religious influence will revert to a kinship models? A decrease in religious influence. Yeah, so it seems to me that is not an issue in terms of kinship. And the reason I think that's not an issue is because although the church, in my argument, is the first mover in altering families, the process went on to build all these anonymous and impersonal institutions, all of which create disadvantages to intensive kinship and large families and whatnot. So, just the operation of modern economic and political systems kind of push against intensive kinship, which is why we see in lots of places in the world, regardless of whether they've adopted, Catholicism, you see the kinship breaking down because these impersonal institutions create safety nets, economic independence, all those kinds of things. And that's really that's what holds the kinship systems together. Were that to change, economic calamities, other kinds of things, then I would expect those kin networks to reform. And this gets back to Linda's question. I think it was Linda. No, it was Daniela's question, which is, underneath kin-based institutions is some powerful pieces of evolved psychology. So incest taboos are built on incest aversion. Kin networks are built on some degree of kin-based altruism, and marriages are built on a pair bonding instinct that we share with gorillas. So just to understand why kin-based institutions are so powerful, you have to take into account certain aspects of evolved psychology. Okay, adoption. So I'm looking at Bob's question. Have you looked at adoption across cultures, and is it essentially an environmental impact driver? I'm not 100% sure what Bob's asking. Let me just use Bob's question to pivot to one other thing that I didn't mention, which is that one of the interesting things the church did was to end adoption. So adoption is very common around the world. So where I work in the South Pacific, about a quarter of kids are adopted, and they're usually adopted by some distant relatives. But then the church ends all adoption, and you don't get the reappearance in Western societies of adoption until, I think, Massachusetts in the late 19th century, and then not again in the UK, I think, until the 20th century. So that's an interesting fact about adoption. Maybe where Bob's going is looking at kids from very different societies adopted and raised in the US. And there's not too much work on that. The work I know suggests that the adoptees are psychologically indistinguishable from the place where they're raised. Okay. Okay, so I'm looking at anonymous attendees' question about whether psychology should look more like social anthropology. I don't think either one is a good model for the other. So I don't think psychology is a good model for social anthropology, nor vice versa. I think that there's a new science we can build that draws the best of what each of these disciplines has to offer. So there are ways to think about cultural evolution. They're not law-like in the way physics is, but they're law-like in the way evolutionary biology is. So there are underlying principles about cultural evolution, about how information flows, about how people learn, that we can use to build and understand how it is and why it is that societies evolve in particular ways, why certain kinds of social phenomena appear. So in my lab, for example, we study things like divination. Why does that pop up in so many different societies? Or ethnicity. Where does ethnicity come from? Why is there ethnicity? So, and these are things that are reoccurring. You see pop up in lots of places. So we can ask questions that are can be both richly contextualized within a specific site, and we can learn from that rich individuality, but then also say something general that's rooted in our understanding of cultural evolution, which is ultimately rooted in our genetic evolution. We are a cultural species because of genetic evolution, but then the genetic evolution isn't enough once we become this cultural species. One of the things I argued in my previous book, The Secret of Our Success, is that a lot of our bodies and brains have been shaped by cultural products. So one obvious example is fire and cooking, which is clearly culturally learned. If I were to drop folks into the forest, you're not making a fire, and cooking is not easy unless you have some technology. But this has shrunk our gut, shortened our colon, gave us small teeth, and made a number of other changes. We may even have genes that make us immune to the toxins in smoke that you don't find in other species, or make us less susceptible to the toxins in smoke. So we're a product of a long-term process of gene culture coevolution that probably extends back 1 million years, at least. Okay, Alina. Behavioral sciences has become increasingly popular in the practitioner world. Lots of sectors. Okay, most of the literature is based on weird, that's right. So is this a problem? So most of the literature on behavioral economics that's been used to make practices to try to fix things comes from studies of weird people. Yeah, I'm worried about that. Now it's fine as long as you're applying it mostly in societies where the culture is sufficiently similar to where the studies were done. But it would be a big mistake to assume these things generalized. And this is one of the reasons why when we transport institutions, say institutions that evolved in Britain or evolved in the US, and we just plunk the Constitution down in another country, and then everyone is surprised that it doesn't operate the way it does in the country where the institution came from. And there's lots of reasons for that. But one is that you need a fit between how people think about the world and their motivations and the institution. So there's a kind of hand in glove fit between these. Doesn't mean you can't make it fit and you can't make adjustments and all this sort of thing. But a lot of practitioner work is driven by the doctrine of psychic unity, by the assumption that aside for dancing and music and food tastes or something like that, we're all more or less psychologically the same. And I think we can come up with a much more powerful practitioner policy related side once we recognize that there is this interesting psychological diversity that we should embrace. Okay, Charlotte Langdon. How does your research mess with the suggestion that individualistic societies have responded more poorly to the coronavirus, Britain and the UK, for example, because they're less concerned with the wider society? You suggested Weird societies are happier to trust strangers and work with impersonal is the suggestion that weird societies trust strangers but don't necessarily care about them. So I think, I mean, we need the proper research, but I think that psychology actually explains quite a bit. So there's three different areas. One is individualism. So that means you want to be your unique self and not have other people tell you what to do. One is tightness. So how tight are the social norms that bind you? So two different dimensions, individualism and tightness. And then your trust in impersonal institutions. And the bad combination for COVID is high individualism, low tightness, and distrust in impersonal institutions. So some states in the US have this problem. So if you have high trust in impersonal institutions, like where I live in Massachusetts, things can operate. People are highly individualistic, but they also have high trust in impersonal institutions and they're a bit tighter. So, you know, our rates are low. But elsewhere where you have a different psychological combination, things go less well. All right. Erica, let's see here. Can you expand a little on your differences in understanding? Yeah, okay. So the differences between shame and guilt. So this is an old difference, an old domain of variation that anthropologists have long noticed. So in societies, so anthropologists describe famously, Ruth Benedict, describe some societies as driven by shame, which means you have this tight network, tight social network, lots of kin relations, and your main concern is not losing face. So not doing something that will shame you, because that shame actually reverberates out. So if you do something shameful, your mother will feel shamed and your cousin might feel shamed and can actually diffuse through your social network. So that all those relatives are also concerned with you not doing something shameful. And so people are very worried about it. When they get shamed, they have to withdraw for a while. In these tight networks, you don't usually get kicked out unless things get really bad. So you just have to kind of lie low for a while. In a guilt world, they tend to be mobile, and everybody can feel guilt for different things. So for example, I might feel guilty for not going to the gym, but that's not something like my neighbors are going to think I'm a bad person because I didn't go to the gym. So it's very much an individual thing. I might think I should do 2 hours of writing in the morning, but I didn't do my writing one day. My neighbors don't care about that. So it's the guilt I feel is about personal standards. Now, of course, my personal standards can be influenced by the society. It'd have to be value domains, otherwise I might not adopt them. So that's the main difference. And it has to do, and then in a guilt-based world, I try, if I do something that makes me guilty and hurts someone else, I was a bad friend or something, I'll try to repair the relationship. So there's actually an approach function to it as opposed to the withdrawal that you see in shame. So hopefully that helps. Okay, Rebecca, why do you start the story at the development of the Christian church and not the basis in Roman law, for example? Okay, Greece, for example. I'm not sure about the Pacific powers. Maybe I'll have to ask you to elaborate on that. But so it's not the Christian church, right? It's one specific branch. So this Armenian doesn't do it, Oriental church doesn't do it, Syrian Christianity doesn't do it, Arian Christianity doesn't do it. It's particularly the church based in Rome that begins to adopt all of these, with the Eastern church being to a lesser degree. It is true that some of those things are Roman heritage. So for example, monogamy, but Roman monogamy was easy to divorce, and it was also, you could have sex slaves. So the church adds a whole other layer to that. Levirate marriage was also okay in Rome. So it's not that there's no heritage there, but the church clearly did something new and different that I think caused a change. Other religions were doing other things. So over in Persia, incestuous marriages became sanctioned by the religion. So people began marrying cousins, royalty even married siblings. So you can, the way I think about it is there's lots of different religions and they're all kind of doing experiments on organizing kinship in the family. And this just happens to be one particular combination that we see in Rome. I mean, the Greek case is interesting because just before the classical period, some of the Greek laws actually weaken the kinship structures. So monogamy gets enforced, but Greek monogamy is you can only marry one Athenian woman. You can have as many non-Athenian concubines as you want. There were also some things about bilateral inheritance. So I think the Greek case and the degree to which the Greeks were individualists in a way that parallels the West is actually another interesting case that supports the argument. Okay. Okay, so Max, anthropologist William Buckner has published a critique of the weirdest people in the world, arguing that evidence you provide for polygyny being part of our evolved psychology is clearly limited. I have not seen that. I feel too confident about my evidence on polygyny. So that's great, but I mean, I look forward to the debate. That's definitely, so I've been working on polygyny for years. There's quite a bit of evidence. There's new evidence that's not even in the book that further supports it. So I'll look forward to that. Okay, Daniela, a lot of people start to change psychology in the advent of herding, right? People can own property as individuals and accumulate it. Yes, well, so we know. So Daniela's question is, so you have a herding lifestyle, it leads to economic constraints, which re-alters the inheritance system, owning property, people have to move around in different ways. And one of the things that alters, I think, is, so Anke Becker, who's an economist, was a postdoc in my lab, is now a professor in the Harvard Business School, did work showing that herding leads to larger female gender inequality. And it's because of the way production is organized. You get a proliferation of social norms that seek to control women because the men have to be far away from the camp with cows and whatnot. And she's able to show that even urban populations who have long since given up the lifestyle, there's still a difference in things like domestic violence and female circumcision and those kinds of things that seems to trace back to these economic differences, which led to certain kinds of social norms and then have these different outcomes. All right, I think that's just about time. Am I right, Laura?
Hi, yes, perfect timing. Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Henrich, for such a thought-provoking and fascinating presentation this evening. Thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We hope you enjoyed the event, and we're going to email you a copy of the video in the next couple of days so you can watch it again. Yeah, so thank you very much. Have a great rest of your day. Have a good evening, everybody, and we'll see you again. Thank you.
All right, thanks, everyone.